Yashva vadod ha'ir abasiyam ha'yisa k'almana rabasi v'agoyim sarasi b'medinais ha'yisa lomas b'chay sivkeh alayla v'dimasa Alecheyo ein loch menachem mikol oihaveho kol roi'eha bageduva hoyu lo yevim kol esa Yehuda me'oini me'roi v'avodo hi Yeshivat Ohr lo motzeh monoyach kol roi defel yisigu ben hametzorim darchei tzion avelos mibli bo'ei moed. A
scholar who wanted to explore the Hasidic movement once came to the Chozeh Lublin, one of the early Hasidic masters, with a problem that we are required to grieve over the destruction of the temple. And the Chozeh Lublin had a reputation of always being joyful, always being happy. So when he confronted the Chozeh replied, "You see my face. You know how I look in public. You don't know what's going on in my heart. In my heart, I'm grieving. In public, I show a happy face to encourage other people." How do we feel when we hear a story like that? I can't speak for you, but I find it very hard to identify. I wish that was my problem. Shall I show my grieving, or shall I keep my grieving to myself and not depress other people? I wish that were my problem. Chiddushei HaBrim quotes a halacha in Shulchan Aruch, a law, that a Yarei Shamayim, someone who has fear of God, should grieve over the temple. And he asks, only someone who has fear of God? Someone who's on a very high spiritual level? Shouldn't everyone grieve over the temple? And he said, two things to learn. Number one, if you don't feel it, then you should know that you lack real fear of God. And then you should grieve over your own churban, over your own destruction, that you don't feel the pain. And that at least don't pretend. Be honest with yourself. If you don't feel it, recognize that. And then try to deal with it somehow. How shall we deal with it? What have we lost? So everyone will say, correctly, we lost the korbanos, the sacrifices. And the Rambam, Maimonides, says in his commentary in the Mishnah that the sacrifices provide Tiyeh hasmadas tikun ha'olam v'sidur mitziuso al derech shalem. The sacrifices provide the continuous perfection, rectification of the world and its organization, the organization of its existence in a perfect fashion. That's what the sacrifices provide. And if you have heard that the Rambam somehow felt sacrifices were secondary, it's a total mistake. This is in the commentary in the Mishnah, where he says, Ovos, Perek Aleph, Mishnah Beis, where the sacrifices provide the entire existence and perfection of the world. Okay, I hear that, I read that, I find it very hard to relate to the sacrifices. Very hard to relate to the fact that the temple was the place where the sacrifices were brought, and I'm missing that. Aliyah L'Regel, 3 times a year, the Jewish people came to Yerushalayim, and they saw the Shekhinah, whatever that means. Ultimately, they had an experience of the divine presence. One of the Hasidic Yisrorim says that you come and God sees you, and you see God as he sees you. So you get an ultimately real perception of yourself, which puts aside all of your rationalizations and all of your fears and all of your hopes, which blur your self-vision. I can read those words, and I can imagine what a precious thing that would be, but I have never experienced anything remotely like it. And therefore, it's very hard for me to feel the loss and to sincerely grieve over it. But this difficulty, this block to grieving is recognized in the Talmud itself. We fast on the 17th of Tammuz. That's the day in which the siege of the second Beis HaMikdash reached its height, and then it plunged into the destruction. The first Beis HaMikdash, first temple, the siege began on the 9th of Tammuz. So the Gemara asks, why don't we fast on the 9th of Tammuz? And the answer is, it's too old. It's too far in the past. We can't relate to it. When the Talmud was written, we're talking about 700 years before. Too old to relate to. So we fast on the anniversary of the last siege of the second temple, but not on the siege of the first temple. The Gemara in Yevamos talks about, according to Rabbi Yossi, a woman who's grieving for the loss of her husband shouldn't get married for 30 days. And the Gemara says, but the restrictions on Tisha B'Av don't last 30 days. They're less than 30 days. 3 weeks, for Sephardim, 9 days. The Gemara says there's a difference between old loss, mourning, and new mourning. We're talking about an individual who suffered her own personal loss. We're more serious, more strict about that than we are about the entire loss of the temple, because it's new, it's fresh, and it's more painful than the loss of the entire temple. So our condition of dulled spirit, our condition of lack of pain, is something which the tradition recognizes. It recognizes. But we need to do something about it. And I think what we could do about it is to realize that the loss of the Beis HaMikdash is the root of many of our contemporary losses, many of our contemporary tragedies. And when we realize that, and when we face tragedies that we do identify with and that we do cry over, we should keep in mind that the root of that tragedy ultimately is the loss of the Beis HaMikdash. And bring the Beis HaMikdash into our contemporary pain and our contemporary suffering. I heard from the Belzer Rabbi, he should be well, in 1977, Shabbos Chazon. He's speaking about the loss of the Beis HaMikdash. And he said, we naturally associate the Beis HaMikdash with the sacrifices. But as a matter of fact, it was also a source of Torah. The Beis HaMikdash was a transmitter of Torah into the world. And one symptom of it is this. There was the chamber of hewn stones, Lish Gazis, where the Sanhedrin was located, and that was on the border of the Beis HaMikdash. As long as that was the place where the Sanhedrin sat, any court in the Jewish people could judge capital offenses. The Sanhedrin moved from there to 9 other locations. As soon as it moved out of that location, no court anywhere could judge a capital offense. Why? Because sitting there, the Shekhinah, God's presence in the temple, had an effect on the Sanhedrin, and through the Sanhedrin to Torah in the whole of the Jewish people. Without that effect, we couldn't take responsibility to judge a person's life and put someone to death. We say, at the end of every tefillah, Yhi Ratzon, she'yibona Beis HaMikdash b'mehera v'yameinu, the temple should be rebuilt speedily. V'sein chalkeinu b'sorasecha, give us our portion in your Torah. V'sham da'avadecha b'yira, we'll serve you there, kimei olam ch'shani k'monios, as in days of old and in former years. V'arvel Hashem minchas Yerushalayim, kimei olam ch'shani k'monios, the offering of Judah and Jerusalem will be as pleasing as it was in former days. The whole Yiratzon is about rebuilding the Beis HaMikdash and offering sacrifices there. What are the words doing in the middle? What are they doing there? That's precisely what the Belzer Rebbe said. The loss of the Beis HaMikdash is not only the loss of the place of the sacrifices, but it's a loss of Chelkeinu B'Sorasecha, our portion. How often do we learn and we don't get it? We don't get it. We break our heads over a Tosfos and we can't get pshat. The Zohar HaKodesh says if you don't get pshat, it's a blockage. It's a blockage and something's wrong. We know that kashas help, but they help when they bring to tirutzim. But if you have a blockage and you don't get the pshat, that means you've lost a piece of Torah. A piece of Torah is not available to you, at least. When you feel that frustration, when you feel that pain, I want to understand it. And you daven, you say, Ribbono shel olam, please help me understand. And you don't understand. You don't get it. And maybe even more than that. We learn. How often do we learn with excitement? How often do we learn with inspiration? The Gemara Bracha says that learning and prayer are two halves of a dialogue with the Kodesh Baruch Hu. In prayer we speak to Him, and in learning, He speaks to us. How often do we feel that a Kodesh Baruch Hu is speaking to us through the Talmud Torah that we do? When we don't feel it, when we reflect how flat it is, when we reflect how little we are identified, we should think back to the Beis HaMikdash. We don't have Chelkeinu B'Sorasecha because there's no Beis HaMikdash. And include our mourning for the Beis HaMikdash and the frustration that we feel over our Talmud Torah. Tefillah. What is the Beis HaMikdash? If you look at Shlomo HaMelech, Malachim Aleph, Perek Ches, Book of Kings, chapter 8, where he dedicates the Beis HaMikdash for several chapters. If you look there at what's going to happen in the Beis HaMikdash, he mentions only one thing. V'shamata el tchinas abdecha ve'amcha Yisrael asher yizpalelu el hamokom hazeh ve'ato tishma. Kodesh Baruch Hu should hear the pleading of his servant, meaning Shlomo HaMelech himself, and your people Israel, that they will pray to this place, and you will hear. He says that over and over again in his dedication. He doesn't mention anything else. He doesn't mention korbanos, sacrifices, at all. And what does Yeshaya HaMelech say? Yeshaya Novi say? I'll bring them to my holy mountain and cause them to rejoice in my house of prayer. Yes, there will be sacrifices on the altar, and they will be for the will of willing acceptance. Because my house will be called a house of tefillah. So Shlomo HaMelech said it, and Yeshaya Novi said it, and when Chazal set up the prayers to be corresponding to the sacrifices, the number, the times, and the regular dinim, they were following the tradition going back to King Solomon. But that means that without the Beis HaMikdash, our prayer is crippled. Indeed, Chazal say, Ninalu Sharei Tefillah. The gates of prayer are locked against us. The Navi says, Gam ki ezak v'ashaveya, even though I will cry out and plead, Sosam Tfilosi. My tefillah is shut up. It's shut up and closed in. It's encased, it can't break out. How often do we daven? How often do we plead with the Kodesh Baruch Hu for something? Even l'shem shamayim. And it doesn't come. And we cry. And we go to Makomos HaKadoshim. And we cry for help. And if it doesn't come, we continue to cry. Those tears, we should associate them in our minds with the Beis HaMikdash. The reason why we're not being answered, the reason why HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't answer our pleas for help, is because there's no Beis HaMikdash. There's no Shekhinah among us. And when we feel that pain and that frustration, we should connect it to the loss of the Beis HaMikdash. Beis HaMikdash had a very special ceremony called Sota. The purpose of Sota was to restore peace between husband and wife. Indeed, part of the ceremony was to write down a section of the Torah on a piece of parchment, including God's name, and to blot it in water. The water erases the God's name, and the Talmud says, how great is peace between husband and wife, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu allowed his name to be erased in order to bring peace between husband and wife. That means that the Beis HaMikdash brought into the world a ruach of harmony in the home. And the Gemara says that if, God forbid, someone divorces his first wife, HaMizbeach Morida loved most, the altar cries for him. Do we have marital problems in our community? There are divorces, which are a terrible tragedy, and there are problems which don't end up in divorce, but people suffer. When we suffer, and when we daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, please help me to have a better relationship with my spouse, to bring up the children better, the home should be a happy home. Remember that the shorish of the failure, the shorish of the pain, is the loss of the Beis HaMikdash, which would have brought a spirit of harmony in the house into the world. The source of these ideas, most poignantly, is the famous Gemara, and in the Midrash, in Eicha, it's spelled out a little more, where it says that in Gamliel's neighborhood, there was a woman who lost a son. And she cried. She cried every night over the loss of her son. And Gamliel, hearing her cry, cried also until his eyelashes fell out. Medrash Eicha says he was crying over the destruction of the temple. She was crying for her son. He was crying over the destruction of the temple. Was he identifying with her? Of course he was identifying with her. He was identifying with her pain, tracing it back to its shorish. The root of her pain, like the root of the pain that engulfs all of us, is ultimately the source of the Churban Habayis. Who doesn't know of sickness? Who's not worried about sickness? Who doesn't suffer from the sickness in the family, in the community, friends, everyone? We say Rafa'enu, everyone has kavanah, because everyone knows people who are in need. What we have to do is associate that in our minds with the Churban Habayis and say, the reason people are sick, the reason, Rahman al-San, people are dying, is because of the loss of the Beis HaMikdash. What about Parnasa? Who's not worried about Parnasa? Making a livelihood, supporting the family, oneself, being able to help others. Chazal say, from the time the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, Na'asu Gishamim Tzimukim La'olam. The rains became dried up for the world. Ein Yordim Me'otzatov. When they come down, they don't come down from a good treasury. They come down at the wrong time. They come down too much or too little. Ein Yom She'ein Bo Klala. There's no day without a curse. That means the inability of the Jewish people to support itself, to pay the bills that need to be paid. How? Teachers in schools suffer because they have gigantic classes and they don't have too little remuneration, not enough support. And we all know this. And we're all worried about it. And we all grieve over it. Transfer that grief to the Beis HaMikdash. It's the loss of the Beis HaMikdash which leads to that kind of pressure, that kind of worry, that kind of loss. Gemara says, from the time that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, Nitla Eitzah Mimenu. We've lost Eitzah. Eitzah means wise counsel. Wise counsel. How many problems face the community, the Jewish people as a whole? Now, I want to insert a very important footnote. It's not up to us to judge our leaders. It's not up to us to decide whether what they are doing is wise or not wise and to pass judgment on it. But the Gemara testifies that it could be much better. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu took wisdom, counsel from us that we don't have on the part that we had once upon a time, times when the Beis HaMikdash was standing. Boshu chaverim uvnei chorin v'chofu rosham. Chaverim, the people who are passionately consistent in the performance of Torah. B'nai Chorin, those who occupy themselves with Torah, are hiding their heads. V'nedaldalu anshe ma'aseh, people who care about the community and are willing to put themselves on the line, put their lives and their livelihoods on the line to help the community, have become very few in number. V'govru ba'alei zroa, people with physical power have asserted themselves, taking over control. U'ba'alei loshen, people who slander others without restraint. Our community suffers from the most absurd critique from the non-Jewish world, and lahavdil from the Jewish world, from those inside and from those outside, people who glory in non-Jewish values, who pretend to be intellectuals, who think of themselves as understanding reality. They have no clue. They have no clue. But they belittle us. They stand with their chutzpah and their enormous self-confidence, and many are depressed. Many feel a lack of self-confidence, a lack of solidity, because they have such prestige. Their voices stride the world. And this is predicted about the last period of history, that we will face this terrible, terrible challenge. This is all rooted in the loss of the Beis HaMikdash. That being the case, when we daven for the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash, we ought to have this in mind. And I must tell you, about 10 years ago, I saw an article from a non-traditional author who said, mourning the Beis HaMikdash is out of date. How are you going to express the churban, the destruction? Look at Jerusalem today. Look at the streets, the parks, the vast housing complexes. Look at the stadiums and the art galleries and the concert halls. How can you say that Yerushalayim is destroyed? What are you mourning? Let's look at the bracha that we say in the Shemona Esrei. V'Yerushalayim yircha beracham v'tashuv. To Jerusalem, your city, in mercy, return. V'zishkom b'socha ka'asher dibarta. Dwell in it as you have spoken. Uvenei yosah b'karov b'yameinu binyan olam. And rebuild it speedily in our days. An eternal building. The building comes third. The building comes third. First, you should return. And second, your Shekhinah should dwell there. And third, build the buildings and pave the roads and make the housing complexes and the stadiums for mass shiurim and the concert halls for Simchas Beis HaShoeva or for other kind of indoor shiurim in the winter. The shell, the physical shell, that's not what we're davening for. I was amazed that someone could write such an article. We're davening for the return of the Shekhinah. It's the lack of the Shekhinah that causes us all of these contemporary sorrows. And that's what we have to be focused on in trying to bridge the gap between our distance from the temple in physical terms, in terms of history, and our feelings for the temple that have to be contemporary. Chiddushei HaRim, who made the comment on the statement of the Shulchan Aruch, that a person who fears God should grieve over the loss of the temple, and pointed out that for many that's not a reality, and we shouldn't fool ourselves. But at least today, take into mind all of the things that bother you now, all of the things that are paining you now, and trace them back to the Beis HaMikdash. Don't blot out your private life and your social life and your family life and your concerns. Bring them in and use them as a bridge to mourning over the Beis HaMikdash. And then, perhaps, today, everyone can qualify for the title in the Shulchan Aruch of Yoreh Shamayim, someone who stands in awe of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in awe of heaven, and we can shed real tears, and in the merit of those tears, in Yetz Hashem, the Beis HaMikdash will be rebuilt.
Yoiv be'apoi Adonai es basiyoin השליך משמיים ארץ, תפארת ישראל, וזכר הדוים לגלוב.
As we know, in Jewish law, there are two types of mourning, two types of hilchos avelos that we have. One is the avelos for someone who, God forbid, has lost a close relative, a parent, a spouse, a child, a sibling. And then we have the public avelos for the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. It has been pointed out that halachically, these patterns of mourning move in two opposite directions. When chas v'shalom someone has a private avelos, it starts off very, very severe. You sit Shiva, and then after Shiva, we have a shloshim, a 30-day, which is a bit more mekel. And for most relatives, after the 30 days, it's all over. For father and mother, there's a more limited avelos for 12 months. But the whole tahalich, the whole progression of private mourning is to go from the more chamor to the less chamor. When it comes to the annual mourning for the Churban Beis HaMikdash, we move in the opposite degree. We start off relatively light with the 3 weeks. Again, on many Sfardim, there's Bechlal, no particular halachas associated with the 3 weeks. Then we have then we have Rosh Chodesh Av, the 9 days. Then we have the week of Tisha B'Av. Then we have Erev Tisha B'Av, and then it reaches a crescendo with Tisha B'Av. The Avelis goes from the Kal to the Chomer. Why by private Avelis we go from the Chomer to the Kal, and public Avelis we go from the Kal to the Chomer? And the explanation that's given is that psychologically the two forms of Avelis serve very different and opposite purposes. With private Avelis, a person is so overwhelmed with their loss that their life is literally destroyed. They can't go on. They're paralyzed with grief. And Avelis is a mechanism that allows a person to have an inner healing so that eventually, la'at, they will be able to join society. So we start off during Shiva, the person doesn't leave their house, people come to him. And then after Shiva, the person begins to reintegrate into society. And the ultimate goal of private Avelis is that eventually a person should continue to live and not be overwhelmed by their grief. One never forgets one's tragedies, but one can compartmentalize it so that life goes on, because it is the ratzon of Hashem that we not be paralyzed with grief. It is the ratzon of Hashem that we continue to live. But be'avonoseinu harabim, with the Churban Beis HaMikdash, the opposite is the case. As we heard earlier, how many of us cannot get up in the morning because grief overwhelms us, it paralyzes us? That I need some type of ritual to take me out of my grief so I can live a normal life. It's lahepech. We go on and on as if there's no problem at all. And we are so emotionally distant from the Churban Beis HaMikdash that we don't even know what it is that we lost. How can a blind person who has never seen color appreciate what it means not to have color? A person that was born deaf, how will they even know what it means not to hear music? We've never even had the experience of nevuah, of hashras hashchina, of closeness to God that the Beis HaMikdash represented. We don't need a ritual to help us overcome our grief. It's fakert, it's exactly the opposite. We need to eventually move from our apathy and our indifference so that perhaps by the physical symbolism of deprivation, not cutting our hair, not listening to music, sitting down on a bench, perhaps, the physical behaviors we engage in will inculcate within us a sense of loss. So it's very simple. In the case of private Avelis, the chamor is natural. You naturally feel tragedy. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to help you get out of it. So we go from the chamor to the kal. With the Avelis of the Beis HaMikdash, we have no feeling at all. And the goal is therefore to give us a shemetz, a little bit of feeling, so that perhaps we could be misabel. But the truth of the matter is, mourning is not just about the past. Chazal tell us that Mashiach is born on the very day of Tisha B'Av. The day of the Churban Beis HaMikdash, the day of the Siluk HaShechina, is the day of the birthing of Mashiach. Maral explains that this does not necessarily refer to an actual birthday of the flesh and blood person who will be Mashiach. The flesh and blood person could have his birthday any day of the year. But it means that the spiritual koach of Mashiach comes into the world based on the mourning, because when we mourn, we show that we care. When we mourn, we show that we yearn to be close to Hashem, that we yearn for the Beis HaMikdash. And it is the very yearning and pining and ishtaikakus for Geula that brings the power of Mashiach in the world. The more we want, the more we desire, the more HaKadosh Baruch Hu will come back into the world. And therefore, the day of Tisha B'Av, the day that is set aside, not only for the particular Chorban Beis HaMikdash, but again, as we heard, for all of the tsaros that have happened because of Siluk HaShechina. We bring Mashiach into the world by the depth of our yearning and by the depth of our mourning. The Gemara in Shabbos tells us that after 120 years, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will ask us a number of questions, and one of those questions is, Sipisa li Yeshua. And Sipisa li Yeshua does not mean, did you believe in Mashiach? All of us will answer for sure. But Sipisa li Yeshua, did you eagerly hope and wait and yearn for Mashiach? There were tzaddikim who would get up, besides Tikkun Chatzos, they would get up every half an hour in the middle of the night, every night, to ask, is Mashiach here yet? Is Mashiach here yet? That's how they felt. How yearning for Mashiach every time, yearning for a world of Devekus B'Hashem, yearning for a world of clarity, yearning for a world in which we had the gift of Nevuah and the Kirvas Elokim, as David HaMelech said, Kirvas Elokim li tov. It is only closeness to God that matters. So when people ask the question, why do we have a Tisha B'Av? I mean, after all, one question is, Baruch Hashem, Eretz Yisrael is built up. And people ask another question. What are you mourning about Tisha B'Av? Let's have a fast day for the Holocaust, and let's have a fast day for pogroms and the Crusades, and all sorts of tragedies that numerically perhaps more Jews died in the Holocaust. Perhaps, although the Gemara has interesting numbers. But again, the short answer is, when there's Histalkus HaShechina, when there's divine presence that's left us, we become vulnerable to everything. Tisha B'Av is the Yom Avelis of Klal Yisrael. That is why in the kinos of Tisha B'Av, you will note, we don't only talk about the Chorban Beis HaMikdash, although most of the kinos do. There are kinos about the Crusades. In recent years, Gedolim have put in kinos about the Holocaust, because all of those sorrows are interconnected. It's not just the temple was destroyed. It's a Siluk HaShechina. Our world is different. A world with the Beis HaMikdash is a different world. But there is a passage in the Talmud Yerushalmi that's very, very sobering. The Talmud Yerushalmi says, any generation in which the Beis HaMikdash is not rebuilt is as if the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. Now let's think about that. One might have thought, well, the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed because the earlier generations were Rishayim, they did tremendous sins, and we're not as bad as them, but we don't have the special zechus that it takes to get the Beis HaMikdash back. That's how one might have understood this. The Talmud Yerushalmi says no. If the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed for certain reasons, and we don't have it back, we must be guilty of those same reasons, because if those reasons wouldn't still exist, the Beis HaMikdash would be rebuilt mimela. And to put it another way, the destruction of the temple was not a past event, but every single second we are redestroying the Beis HaMikdash. We are throwing our fire onto the wood and onto the stones. We are being machriv the Beis HaMikdash, because if we don't have it back, by definition, we are responsible for the Chorban, because the Yerushalmi says, any door shalo nivne biyamav ki'ilu nechrava biyamav. As a result, it behooves us very much to look at Tisha B'Av not only as a day of Avelos, a day of mourning, a day of sadness, but a day of introspection, a day of resolve, a day of building, a day of asking ourselves, how can I rebuild the Beis HaMikdash? And the truth of the matter is, what is the Beis HaMikdash? When the Torah introduces the idea of a Mishkan, a tabernacle, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe, V'yasu li mikdash, build for me a sanctuary, v'shachanti b'socham, so I will dwell in their midst. And Chazal say, the pasuk does not say, v'shachanti b'socho, I will dwell in the building, but I will dwell, Hashem says, in the heart and the soul of Am Yisrael. The Beis HaMikdash is a symbol not of a Shekhinah dwelling in the Mikdash, but of a Shekhinah dwelling within us. And as a result, when our heart and our soul are no longer pure enough to contain the Shekhinah, the Beis HaMikdash becomes a simple building that anybody could destroy. The Medrash Eicha tells us, then when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, he was miskaya, he was boasting, he was proud. He said, I destroyed God's house. And God's answer was, sorry, I don't live there anymore. I left. When the Shekhinah could no longer be within Bnei Yisrael, I left. So yeah, you could destroy the house I used to live in, but I don't live there anymore. So when we talk about the obligation of building a Beis HaMikdash, we're not talking about bombing the Temple Mount and getting rid of the mosques. We'll have to leave that to Mashiach, according to the Rambam. But we are talking about making our heart and our soul a repository for the Shekhinah, because when there is, just as v'yasu li mikdash v'shachanti b'socham, we can also read the pasuk in reverse. V'shachanti b'socham, when I am dwelling in your midst, v'yasu li mikdash, then there will be a Beis HaMikdash. So our job is v'shachanti b'socham, and then HaKadosh Baruch Hu will bring, according to the Rambam, Mashiach will build the third temple. According to Rashi, the third Beis HaMikdash will actually come down, min hashamayim, but not before v'shachanti b'socham. So what do Chazal tell us? All of us know the well-known Gemara in Yuma, that the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed because of avodah zarah, idolatry, gilui arayos, sexual immorality, shvichas damim, murder. The second Beis HaMikdash, the Jews were relatively righteous. They kept mitzvos. They learned Torah. But the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed because of sinas chinam, because of hatred, polarization, disunity among Am Yisrael. And the Gemara goes on and says, Bo ura'eh, come and see the first Beis HaMikdash that was destroyed because of avodah zarah, gilui arayos, shvichas damim, the worst averos in the Torah, the three averos you have to give up your life before you transgress. And the Chorban B'sach HaKol was 70 years. And then we came back and we had a Bayis Sheni. But the Chorban that comes because of sinas chinam, already in the time of the Gemara, it was 1,000 years, or almost 1,000 years. And now, how much more? The year 70 was the Chorban. It's now the secular year, 2015. Almost 2,000 years. Sinas chinam. And if we apply the Yerushalmi that says any generation in which the Mikdash was destroyed is as guilty as the duration of the Chorban, I don't think we need to prove from a Yerushalmi how much sinas chinam is present in Am Yisrael. The polarization, the divisiveness, the indifference. Sinna does not have to be you're insulting somebody, or you're throwing rocks at somebody, or you demonize them. There can be cold sinna as well. The sinna of indifference, the sinna of not caring about people who are outside our clique, outside our group, not regarding other Jews as having chashivas or importance. The Nitziv writes that even a religiosity l'shem shamayim can be a manifestation of sinas chinam. When you look at other Jews with other shitas and you call them apikorsim or kofrim, or as people often say, those who are more religious than I, those to the right of me, are fanatics. and those to the left of me are apikorsim, heretics. It is where I am, whoever I am, that is b'diuk, the right place. And the Netziv says this was the churban of the Bayis Sheni, the sinas chinam of the Bayis Sheni. So we live in a world where we divide Klal Yisrael into thousands and thousands of little mini groups, in which each group looks at the other. Chazer, treif, no good. And, unfortunately, sinas chinam becomes contagious. Because Shlomo HaMelech writes, Kamayim hapanim el panim, kain leif ha'adam li'adam, as water reflects the face that you show it, so the heart of a person reflects what is shown to that heart. If I look at water, I put my face in a reflection of water. If I smile at the water, I get a smiling face. If I frown at the water, I get a frowning face. This is what the pasuk says. So the heart of a person will mirror back what you show that person. You look at that person with disdain and with hatred, or with coldness and indifference, they will look at you the same way. You look at a person with love and with respect, they will feel that same way about you. So sometimes you might ask yourself, so why do I have to be the first one to start that? Let the other person look at me with respect and I'll like them. Why do I have to be the one that starts? Well, as the saying goes, life is not always fair. But if a person is a ben Torah, and a person is a shomer mitzvahs, and a person takes God's responsibilities seriously, then we do what we have to do, whether the other side, whoever the other side is doing it or not. And we have to start. It has to start with people who believe in Torah, who believe in mitzvahs, who believe in Geula, who believe in Mashiach. And we start. And if we start, the Chacham Mikol Adam has promised us, Kamayim el panim, the love and the care that we show others will come back to us. And you have to start. Otherwise, all you continue is the cycle of sinas chinam that has already dragged down. You know, Josephus was a Jewish general, and he was kind of the Benedict Arnold. He surrendered his army to Rome, and he lived out the war against Rome. He lived in Rome. But he wrote a history. He wrote an eyewitness history of the Churban. And obviously he was living in Rome, so a lot of his observations are a little jaundiced. We can't accept them. But he quotes Titus Harasha. Titus Harasha was the Roman general, who later became emperor, but the Roman general who actually destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. And he quotes Titus, who was observing the infighting among Jews in Yerushalayim. And Josephus quotes him as saying, you know, I really don't have to destroy this city at all. If I just wait long enough, the Jews will do it themselves. Now, I normally would not trust anything Josephus says about Titus, but in light of our Chachamim's observation of sinas chinam, it's quite believable that that was actually said. So this is something we have to think about. You know, when we think about becoming more frum, we think about zealousness, we think about religiosity. So we think about, correctly so, learning more, davening more, being more meticulous, being more passionate. But somehow, we never include in our fiery passion to have a fiery passion of Avas Yisrael, to have a fiery passion of Makabel Kol Adam B'Sever Panim Yafos. That should also be part of the fiery passion to become a better of Eved Hashem. It can't be that the more religious we become, the more denigrating we are of others. It can't be, because that is moving against the tikkun of the Aveira of sinas chinam that could bring Geula into the world. So we have to think that side by side with the zealousness and the bren, the fire that we have in our learning and our davening and our mitzvahs, we should also include a bren for the mitzvah of Yahavta l'reacha kamocha. And as the Baal Tanya says, even people who have ideas that may not be acceptable within the framework of Torah, there is still a concept. You love them even if you hate and must disagree with the idea because you love the godliness within them. You love the goodness within them. But if that is true, even for ideas that are against Torah, kal v'chomer uben beno shel kal v'chomer, it has to be true for other shittas which are not keneged Torah, they're just not the particular hashkafa that a person has. Whether it's Torah im derech eretz, or Torah umada, or whether it's dati liyumi. These might be ideas that are not totally makubal in the world of the yeshiva, and we have to follow the shittas that were taught and the hadracha of our rabbeim. But why with bitterness? And why with exclusion? And why with demonization? And why with creating fences, even though there is so much in which from Yidden, agree upon and share? Is this not also sinas chinam? So there's much that we have to think about. The tsaras that certainly we face in Eretz Yisrael, the polarization of religious and secular, the problems with the draft, tremendous problems. And they come because of the Chorban Beis HaMikdash, indeed. But I would add, it's not only the Chorban Beis HaMikdash that causes the problem, but the reason for the Chorban Beis HaMikdash causes the problem. Sinas chinam. One other point, I want to quote another Gemara. The Gemara in Nedarim gives another reason for the Chorban Beis HaMikdash, which is very strange. It says the Chorban Beis HaMikdash occurred shelo berchu b'Torah techila. They were learning Torah, but they didn't make the brachos before the Torah. And because they didn't make the brachos before the Torah, we have the Chorban Beis HaMikdash. Very strange Gemara. Is the Gemara talking about the Bayis Rishon, or is the Gemara talking about the Bayis Sheni? It's very clear that the Gemara is talking about the Bayis Rishon, because it said they asked the Nevi'im what was the reason for the sin, and the Nevi'im didn't know. There were no Nevi'im by the Chorban Bayis Sheni. So it must have been the Chorban Bayis Rishon. But if that's so, it's a pella. The Gemara is asking, why was the Bayis Rishon destroyed? Because they didn't make Birchas HaTorah? The Bayis Rishon was destroyed because of Avodah Zarah, Gilei Arayos, Shvichas Damim. And they asked the Nevi'im, and the Nevi'im didn't know what the sin was. The whole book of Nevi'im is filled with what the sins are. The Nevi'im certainly knew. That was their job. So how could the Gemara identify a relatively minor prohibition called Lo Birchu B'Torah Techila as a reason for the Chorban, if indeed for the Mikdash Rishon the reason of the Chorban was Avodah Zarah, Gilei Arayos, Shvichas Damim? And Rav Elia Lapian offers a beautiful interpretation. Chazal knew, not only Chazal, the Nevi'im knew 100% that the actual Averos that caused the Chorban Bayis Rishon are Avodah Zarah, Gilei Arayos, Shvichas Damim. They knew that. That is beferish. But their question is a meta question. It's a question above that, and that is, given the fact that Yidden were learning Torah, why didn't the Torah elevate them? Why didn't it protect them? How could it be that a person learns Torah in the morning and then in the afternoon commits Avodah Zarah, Gilei Arayos, Shvichas Damim? It's like saying, you had a good morning Seder, and then you go out in the afternoon, you murder a few people, and get back in time for the afternoon. That's their kasha. How could it be that the Torah that they learned didn't change them, didn't elevate them, didn't make them a different type of person? And on that, the answer is, Lo berchu b'Torah techila. How is that an answer? If you remember in the beginning of the book of Malachim, when Dovid HaMelech was towards the end of his life, he was covered with garments, and the garments gave him no warmth. He was cold, he was shivering. And Chazal say, the reason is, if you treat clothing with disrespect, the clothing will not help you later. And Dovid HaMelech, when he was being pursued by Shaul, at one point cut off a piece of Shaul's garments. He showed disrespect to garments. Therefore, they did not, even a different garment, did not protect him. So Rav Elia says, what do you see from that Gemara? That which you treat with disdain, even an inanimate object, is not going to help you when you need it. So Rav Elia says, if it's true that if I'm a vaza es habagadim, I don't get warmth, then if I'm mavazeh the Torah is not going to help me. Lo bercha b'Torah techila, therefore, is the following. By not blessing Hashem for the Torah, that shows an attitude that they considered the Torah a burden. They didn't consider it a gift. They didn't have passion and geschmack. It was something they did because they had to do it. But they didn't treasure it. They didn't cherish it. They weren't machshav it. So the Gemara doesn't mean it was because of that sin that the temple was destroyed. But because they weren't machshav the Torah did not elevate them. It did not purify them. And as a result, they could commit the sins of avodah zarah, gilui arayos, shvichus damim, which was the actual reason of the Churban. The musar to us is that if we want our Torah and we want our mitzvahs to purify us, to elevate us, to make us a different type of person, it is not enough to simply do these things superficially. But we have to learn to appreciate the gifts that Hashem gives us, to look at our Torah with simcha, with joy, with slavos, with enthusiasm, with geschmack. Because otherwise, chas v'shalom, we fall under the category of mavazeh HaTorah. If one is mavazeh HaTorah, then even if you do all of the learning that you're supposed to be doing, in the afternoon you can do avodah zarah, gilui arayos, shvichus damim. So these are some things we think about, a day of cheshbon hanefesh. And the one thing I can say once again is to conclude with Chazal's statement, that if we take these matters to heart, if we think about being mesaken sinas chinam, if we think about being mesaken lo birchu b'Torah techila, if we yearn for the Beis HaMikdash, if we try to understand and try to visualize what it is that we're missing, which is very, very hard, then indeed, as the Maral says, that will be the power that will bring the koach of Mashiach in the world. That will be the day that Mashiach is born. And as the Navi Zechariah says, that day of the 9th of Av will become a day of sasein v'simcha. May it be b'mheira v'yameinu. Amen.
Eichayu am zahav, yishne hakesem hatoiv, tishtapech no abnei karidesh, v'roish kol chutzois.
Chazon Ish, Ayom Mer, he used to say, the Chazon Ish, that a Jew must learn to live with contradictions. And he cited as evidence of that we're taught, we have a Masorah tradition from the Talmud, that a prophet must be in a state of happiness to be eligible for getting nevuah, for getting his prophecy. It would then follow that if Lamentations, Eicha, which is written by the prophet Yirmiyahu, is written with Ruach HaKodesh, with nevuah, then he had to be besimcha when he wrote Lamentations Eicha. Hayatochen, how is that possible? The whole theme, the sequence, the descriptions that ensue there are very, very heavy and sorrowful. In fact, Tisha B'Av itself has a kind of ironic and paradoxical state, because it's also in the text of Eicha we find that it's called a moed, it's called a holiday, and that has halachic ramifications. So there's an irony there. There's a paradox there, that the inception of that nevuah. So it brings to mind what we're told was said by Reb Chaim Volozhiner. The Gemara asks that the Beis Mikdash destroyed, and that every generation is responsible. But on the other hand, kol ha-mesabel, anybody that mourns for Yerushalayim, zeiche v'roya b'simchosa, he sees its simcha. It's in the present tense. Now, one would have thought that it might have been phrased in the future tense. As a result, as the gaining of that mitzvah, then he's eligible for seeing it in the future. But that's not what it says. It says at the moment. So Chaim Volozhiner is quoted as having explained that we're taught by Yosef, that Yaakov, his father, refused to receive consolation for him. Why? Because the gzeira, the decree that is built into the nature of the human condition is that if somebody is in fact gone, has died, then it's nishkach min alev. The mess is nishkach min alev. But if he's alive and just people think he's dead, that's not good enough. So Yaakov was unable to accept consolation for Yosef because Yosef was in fact still alive, though he had been told, Yaakov, that Yosef was gone. Similarly, said Reb Chaim Volozhiner, Klal Yisrael continues to mourn for the Beis Mikdash. That's evidence that the very inconsolability is per se evidence that the Beis Mikdash Shel Mala, that Beis Mikdash above, still exists and is waiting to descend. When? Be'ita achishena. Either it'll come in its time, or we can make it happen earlier, dependent upon our actions, on our performance. Perhaps we might say that this idea of the Chazon Ish is that our existence is replete with paradoxes, and we must learn somehow to meet this challenge. I would put forth that this is inherent in the nature of man. We have a machlekes early on in Shulchan Aruch between the Beis Yosef and the Ramah on the brocha mafli lases, brocha vashe yotza. Mafli lases. What a wondersome, amazing creature this man is, says Beis Yosef. The intricacy of this creation called the body of man. Mafli lasos. Who could dream of such a creation? The Ramah says it's the improbability of two realms of existence being united. Angel, animal. Two worlds, but they're put together in a new creature called man. Mafli lases. Mafli lases. So man then, according to the Ramah, is created in a state of contradiction. We can then understand that the challenge of human existence is how to resolve this contradiction. It's an ongoing, daily, hourly, from minute to minute, second to second challenge of how do we reconcile contradictions. I have, by the way, understood, and some of us have shared the idea that that's why we spend so much time on Talmud Babli, which our source is Eicho, v'machashakem hoshivani, that in the darkness of Galut, when there's a hester ponim, there's a hiddenness of, we don't see the obvious, overt presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's implied. It's there. If you scratch the surface, you're going to see it. But you have to plumb the depths a bit, and a lot. And so we spend so much of our time resolving the contradictions of the Gemara in order to learn, to attain to a level of expertise in how to resolve the essential contradictions of what it means to be human. Man, angel, animal. How to achieve that sense of reconciliation. The resolutions will come through gaining to the expertise in the Shakla V'Talia, the question and answer, the dialectic of the Gemara, which tutors us, instructs us, and in fact, Chazal find the source in Eicha. Why in Eicha? Because that's initiating a period of Hester Ponim, of hiddenness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Pesach, we mentioned that we cite the nail of the Seder, the night of the Seder, that the night, the very night of the week that the Seder falls out, Tisha B'Av will also fall out. And we call attention to it during the different customs of the egg, the dipping in the salt water, the cyclical nature of the egg, cylindrical, symbolizing the calendar and the cycle of human existence. Pesach is a festive time. What does that have to do with Tisha B'Av? We go to great lengths to celebrate the festivity of Pesach. Two kinds of companies. One does well only in a very, very bull environment in the market, when things are very prosperous, does very well. But it doesn't have a strategy on how to deal with recessions and depressions. Another company doesn't do that well in the prosperity, but it has a game plan on how to handle the recessions and the depressions. We're already being taught Pesach time that Klal Yisrael is going to have its ups and downs in history. Did it have to be that way? No. That's a function of our performance. But that is the way there will be the denouement, the unfolding of Jewish history. And therefore, to know then that we have a game plan on how to deal with the bear markets, the spiritual bear markets, when Klal Yisrael will be at that brink of falling into chapter 11, not having fulfilled the 10 commandments, we fall into chapter 11, and it's the irony of knowing that that is what's waiting, not necessarily, but probably, and we will be able to deal with it. I find that hinted at, that the Haggadah is the number 4 is recurrent, symbolizes the matriarchs, 4 questions, 4 sons, 4 Lashonos of Gula. That's hinted at in the 4ness. Matriarchs were 4. In Eicha, we read, V'hayisinu ke'yesemim ein ov. We're like orphans without a father. What's missing? The father. And Shlomo HaMelech says, Shma b'ni, listen, my son, to the Musa, to the ethic of your father. That you have to pay attention. Listen, listen. If you don't pay attention, you're not going to hear it. But regarding Torah Imecha, the Torah of your mother, what does it say? Al titosh, don't abandon it. If you don't do something to abdicate, absolve your connection to that, then it's there. It's a fact of your existence. You're Jewish because your mother was Jewish. That's halachic gerus. So if you don't do a kum v'aseh, that's the matriarchal mode. Begins Pesach. Klal Yisrael was passive. The Rebbeinu Shalom reached to them. It happened to them. They didn't make it happen. And that will escort us in the bleakest and most grim moments in Jewish history, there will be that matriarchal mode, v'yinak yasemim ein ov. We will be like, we're missing the ethic musavicha, but there'll still be the Torah simecha. If we still remain inconsolable, if we still remain connected to that space. I've seen various versions of the story of Napoleon riding around Paris on Tisha B'Av, but the first one I heard, and I remain with, though I've seen other variations of it, is that he saw the Jews out in the yard of the Chatzar, of the Beit Knesset, sitting on the floor by candlelight, and he, after querying what this was all about, and he was told, he said, they're going to make it back. Anybody that can still remain connected to this idea, to this concept, to this sense of mourning for that which was, that means it's current. It's there, it's now, it's happening now. They'll make it back. That's in fact because the matriarchal mode, that if somebody isn't consciously uprooting it, altitosh, isn't abandoning it, then even just merely in a passive state, it begins to happen to them, and it continues to happen to them in history. And so, when Jews come together to read the Navi, to read Yirmiyahu, and to restate their sense of Aveilus, it's a bittersweet moment. It's a moment, a paradoxical moment, that's replete with all of the irony of the human condition. We take a sense, it's kol moyed. It's a sense of celebrating the fact that we continue to mourn. Ben Hashem should give us all the zchut to participate in being Mekabel Ponim Mashiach and seeing the Beis Megdash. Hey, Rabbi Ameinu.
Hashivenu Adonai Elecha v'noshuvo Chadei Shameinu Kikeh